Okay, so having put in my sky, I'm now going to go to my background, and I've decided that I will use a tint really of my blue as I come forward now rather than saturation. So you can see that this is still very pale. It's right into the distance. I'm going to paint in the whole of this background in this very pale tint. I'm going to keep adding white. I've got to be very careful that I do not want this to get too dark, because I've got to come a long way forward until I get to my dark full colour, which will happen probably around the end of the middle ground and before the foreground. So I'm going to go ahead and do this one. Then into the middle ground, I'm still going to use a tint, but I'm going to use a bit more colour this time by the time I get to here. So you'll join me again by the time I've finished this hill in the middle ground, which is going to be darker than this background and definitely darker than the saturated sky I created. So here we are with the completed background. I'm now going to move on to the middle ground. Please remember that when you're trying to control your brush, getting it to paint with, as we get more precise detail, the closer to the foreground we get, please hold your fingers onto the metal, place your wrist on the page, and you're going to place, particularly when we get to these darker lines, you're going to place and pull. You can see now that the colour I've chosen, it's still a tint. I've still added white to that original colour, but I'm now place and pull, really focusing on a slightly darker tint than I used into this background colour. And now the next area of middle ground, I'm still into this middle ground, but I've now started onto my buildings. You can see what's happening here. You can see it's slowly going from the very pale sky, and as it recesses or goes backwards, it gets lighter, and as it comes forward, it's slowly going to get darker. So my next colour, I am actually interestingly going to use a tint, so I'm not going to add white this time. I'm going to stick with, saturation. I'm going to stick with the colour, but I'm actually going to add just a small amount of water so that it takes some of that intensity. It's not my solid colour. I'm going to save that for this section here. But I've still got a much stronger colour. I'm placing and pulling again. Remember, I've got that brush control. I'm placing and pulling, and I'm filling this area with something slightly darker than the one above, but I'm still leaving myself some colour that I can work onto here, a shade and then a darker shade into the foreground. Okay, so there we have sky, palest background area, background, middle ground, paler but slightly more. Remember that I used a tint of that. I've then come into the middle ground here as I've come forward, and I've used a saturation of my colour, but it's a bit paler. As I come towards the foreground now, and I'm going to be doing this area of the middle ground, foreground, between the two, I'm just going to use the pure colour now. So here we go, should be quite intense, making sure that I'm really in control of this brush, that I place it and I pull it. I turn my hand whenever I need to, I place and I pull the brush in the direction I want. I want to be totally in control of this paint. I don't want the brush getting away from me. I shouldn't be rubbing it backwards and forwards. I'm just placing and pulling and placing and pulling. That way the colour is going in the direction that I want it to, particularly when I've got these sharp corners that I want to get into here. Okay, so join me back once I have completed this middle ground, foreground area of buildings here. Okay, so here we are at the final stage then, into the foreground. And the foreground means the thing closest to you as you're looking at this scene. And you can see already how receding it is, how it slowly gets lighter and lighter and gives you this illusion. And it is just an optical illusion that you can see far into the distance. So I'm going to go ahead now, and I have added black to my full colour here, and as you can see, I've got to work quite closely and carefully with this, and in fact I think I need a little bit more black, I think, into that. It's going to end up covering up the word foreground, but I don't mind that too much. So right up to the edge of that, and I'm going to completely fill this area now here really carefully. I'm going to have to place and pull, particularly as I've got more detail with those chimneys I think that I talked about. Place and pull, not scrabbling my brush backwards and forwards because I want to be in control of where I want this paint to go. So down it comes. Okay, and you'll join me back when I have finished adding the foreground. And so there we have a very basic atmospheric perspective, and I think you can see, although we've added no detail at this stage and nothing real, what we have created is that illusion of being able to see, as I said, a long way into the distance. And all we have used in order to achieve that is this range of painting techniques. So saturation by adding water, tint to our colour by adding white to make it lighter, or shade by adding black to make it darker. We can create this illusion using any colour. There are other perspective techniques which we'll talk about, but for today, that is atmospheric perspective.